Okay. So with that, David, I'm going to turn it over to you and your subject today, Bill Dunlap. Thank you both for being with us for Amherst 73 Speaks.
Great, Jim. Thanks. Thanks again for being the technical advisor without whom this wouldn't happen. And welcome, Bill. Thanks a lot for agreeing to talk to us about your interesting career. So as Jim mentioned, we're going to try to save 15 minutes roughly for questions at the end, but we got quite a bit to cover before then. And as you see behind Bill, there's a grandfather clock and a portrait of an old white guy, which is a good place to start with Bill's backstory in New Hampshire, which goes back many grandfathers. So why don't you start there?
Sure, Dave. So my family has been in New Hampshire for a long time, since before the Revolution, actually. And I don't think they were very adventurous when Horace Greeley said, "Go west, young man." My ancestors moved from Chester, New Hampshire to Bedford, which is about 20 miles west, and that was about it. Although there was a branch of the family that fought for the Confederacy, so a few of them escaped. But I grew up in a small town in New Hampshire, just outside Concord, and it was a pretty sort of Norman Rockwell kind of an upbringing here, and then went to public high school here, very good small public high school, and then on to Amherst.
And you mentioned that when we talked earlier, that two of your ancestors were pretty well-known cabinet makers, and that Amherst, presumably it's the Mead Art Museum, has one of their pieces.
That's right. For those who are into there's a very passionate group of collectors of fine antique furniture in the world, and sort of a parallel universe. I know it pretty well due to my job. And there were the most famous cabinet makers in a lot of New England were the Dunlap cabinet makers. And one of them was there were two brothers, Samuel and John, and one of Samuel is my direct ancestor, grandfather to like the seventh power or something. And I had talked about this some earlier before I was getting hired by the New Hampshire Historical Society, but I had never really researched it very deeply. My mother had always said, "Oh yeah, we're descended from this famous cabinet making family," but much to my relief, I was a direct descendant. So all the stuff I'd been saying was actually true, which was a relief. And so yeah, the Mead has a Samuel Dunlap slant front desk that was made by this ancestor, Samuel Dunlap. And their pieces are in the Metropolitan Museum and Winter Tour and the MFA in Boston, and the New Hampshire Historical Society has several of their pieces as well. So yeah, it's an interesting backstory. It's a fun thing for somebody in a job like mine, because I go to work in a building where there's a piece of furniture made by this ancestor back in about 1780, and I walk by this high chest every day on my way to my office.
It's pretty cool. So how did you get to Amherst?
So as I said, I went to the small public high school. St. Paul's School is fairly close by, and they run a very good summer program for public school kids the summer after your junior year of high school, called the Advanced Studies Program. And you get a college level course in 6 weeks, and that's kind of a place where a lot of kids get exposed to. They have a college day, and so admissions people come to St. Paul's and you meet them, so you sort of get connected that way. Dean Wilson came and interviewed, and us, a small group. I asked what I thought was a very incisive question, and he just shot it down and said, "You obviously haven't read any background material about Amherst, so you'd know the answer to this." And so, but we had several family friends who'd gone to the college. And so I just, I came and looked at it and absolutely, fell in love with Amherst.
So what did you, tell us a little bit about your career there? What you studied, majored in, and you didn't actually graduate with our class. So what did you take off time to do?
So, yeah, I entered as a member of the class of 73. As I said to you earlier, David, unlike some of my classmates who went along and to grad school at very good places, I was kind of happy to get through the 4 years at Amherst. It took 5, although I didn't flunk out, but I intentionally took a year off. I was English major. I was co-captain of the ski team. And I was advertising manager for the Amherst Student 1 year, which was an interesting job. I think it's the only paid position at the newspaper. And as I related to you when we spoke earlier, I decided to get married after my junior year at Amherst. I had gotten very interested in transcendental meditation, which was very hot at the time. I shouldn't put it that way because I still meditate now, but decided I wanted to go study in Europe with Maharishi, and my wife, then wife, now wife, Sue, or then girlfriend, now wife. We wanted to go together, and you had to be married to go to this course. So I came home Labor Day weekend, right before my senior year was going to start, and told my father. I'd just been in California for a month, so I came back and said, I want to drop out of Amherst for the coming year. I want to get married, and I want to go study with Maharishi next year. So sort of, you can imagine how my father reacted to that, like most fathers of his generation would have. It wasn't really popular. Let's just say he didn't think I was a really good decision maker, but we did it all. I mean, I said, we're going to do it, and they kind of couldn't stop us. My father-in-law was a football player at Ohio State, and I was this effete Easterner with shoulder-length hair. So I don't think he was really happy about this, and as neither was my father. Any event, we did all that, went and studied meditation, came back, lived off campus my senior year, and Sue got a job at a bank in town, and I finished up at the college. And I'm quite certain I'm one of those students that none of the faculty remembers. Pretty sure about that. But I was a solid sort of B student, and I had decided I really did not want to go to grad school. I kind of want to go off and start doing other stuff. But I absolutely loved my experience at the college.
And what did you do in terms of career before you became the head of the Historical Society and started working with nonprofits?
So I think I'm a good sort of exemplar of the liberal arts approach, because my career has not been kind of a linear one. Obviously, as I said, there's no one way to do things. Some people get advanced degrees and pursue a career, and it follows logically. Mine sort of kind of ping-ponged around. So after graduating from Amherst, took a shot at teaching meditation for a while, and determined that was probably not going to be a good economic decision for the long run, being married and with a child on the way. So got a job in corporate America, ended up working for Xerox Corporation back in the late 70s, and then decided I wanted to do an entrepreneurial kind of business in that field. So I started a small company that distributed office equipment, photocopiers and fax machines and the like, and we did leasing, and it worked out well. It was based in New Hampshire. We had an office in Massachusetts, and I just happened by luck to pick an industry that was it's not the same industry today, but in the 70s and 80s, it was a very good business to be in. Did well, sold the company to a large corporate entity, Fortune 500, went to work as I stayed with them because they let the previous presidents of their companies stay on. It was actually a great job. They said, you can work 1 day per year if you want. We don't really care how much you work. The only thing we care about is we're going to give you your business plan on January 1st, and you make your plan. And if you don't make your plan, we have something that we have to talk about. But if you make your plan, we're happy. So it was sort of like having your own business, but you had the support of this big company. And I did some merger and acquisition work for them. Anyway, it started to get corporate and political after a few years, so I left and went into a small manufacturing company that I owned and operated. Discovered I was not particularly good at manufacturing. It's a very different skill set in business compared to what I had been doing. So got out of that business, sold it. And I had done a lot of nonprofit board work. I had chaired some boards of trustees. I had chaired capital campaigns for an independent school here in New Hampshire. And so I had a lot of experience there, and I started getting calls from people asking me to come visit with their board to talk about, what I had done a lot of, and decided I'll hang out a shingle and start consulting for nonprofits, which I did. And the New Hampshire Historical Society happened to be a client. I was at this independent consulting for about 4 years or so, and they hired me to do strategic planning, business planning, and preparation for a capital campaign. So I was working for them. My predecessor at the Historical Society resigned to take another position. They had a search. They hired a guy from Fairfield County, Connecticut, who was an investment banker, decided he wanted to move to New Hampshire. Problem was, 2 days before it was going to be announced, he called the chairman of the board of the society and said, I can't come after all. I have not told my wife until last evening that we're moving to New Hampshire. And she said, we're not moving to Siberia. And so that was off. I then presented to the board, not realizing that they were actually sizing me up. It was kind of a job interview that I was not aware was happening. And they offered me the job soon thereafter. I'm not a professional historian, and I'm not a museum person, but they liked, my predecessor was a business and a Harvard MBA, had done a very good job at the Historical Society, so they decided they wanted somebody with business background like I had, but also had an affinity for the nonprofit world. And I certainly had some expertise in the history field, partly due to having taken a lot of American Studies courses at Amherst. So that's how I ended up. But I mentioned earlier, I'm kind of I think I'm an example of how liberal arts works, because it teaches you that you can sort of adapt and do new things and learn new things, and not just proceed on sort of a linear path career-wise. That was 12 years ago that I started as the Historical Society's president.
So you came into the Historical Society museum archive world at a time when it was going from objects you had to come in and see in person to a digital world. So talk a little bit about that and how you were sort of the instrumental, if not the actual midwife of the digitization of the collection, or the start of that. I know it's still ongoing.
Yeah. I'd like to take credit for being the originator of this idea, but places like ours are doing this all around the country and the world. But it's been a boon to people in our field. Our collection at the New Hampshire Historical Society consists of around 35,000 objects, three-dimensional objects, fine art, furniture, militaria, ceramics, textiles, farm tools, you name it. And about 2 million pages of archives and about 250,000 photographs. And so, as you said, Dave, previously people had to visit us physically to see any of this stuff. And by being able to digitize it and make it available through our website in an electronic catalog, it just really opened things up. And so made the collections way more accessible. And so we've discovered, for example, that now the majority of our members, new members coming to society, join via our website. We have around 20 to 25% of our members are from beyond the borders of New Hampshire, because somebody in, California, maybe they have New Hampshire roots or some interest, they can access our material and never have to physically visit. So we undertook the capital campaign that I was helping the society plan at the time they hired me, raised about $7 million, and about half of that money was put into digitization, to build a really powerful website. And to just physically digitizing material is time consuming. You've got to put what they call metadata with every digital record, so that one of the big problems, for example, with photographs is historical photographs. A lot of times you have no clue who the subjects of the photographs were, because nobody, how you write on the back of a photograph, people didn't do it. So having the data attached to the image is critical. So anyway, we've been at this now for, well over a decade, and it's helped us. It's created the foundation. Our digital archive has helped us build a foundation to do some of our other initiatives, which I know we'll talk about.
So what are some of the Historical Society's more important collections, both physical or documentary?
Well, we have the collection. We're sort of the presidential library of President Franklin Pierce. Now, it may shock you to know that Franklin Pierce is not listed among the very top American presidents. In fact, he's usually in the bottom 5 or 6. But he still is an American president and still has a fascinating. He's a Bowdoin alum. He was very close friends with Hawthorne, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and he's an interesting fellow. And so we have his collection. We have Daniel Webster's papers, arguably, although not a president, a probably more prominent historical figure. And Webster's papers are fascinating there because they're in these volumes, and Dartmouth also has some of his stuff, but we have the majority. And you'll see a page that's talking about a letter he wrote to the King of Spain discussing some treaty, and then you flip to the next page, and it's a letter to his farm manager in New Hampshire telling him to plant more turnips next year, because he was very interested in he was a gentleman farmer and kept a farm up here for his summer home. So Webster's great. We also have David Souter's papers. Souter was a longtime trustee of the Historical Society. He was among the board members on the search committee that hired me, even though, as I told the story earlier, that they offered me the job because the guy they thought they were going to hire bailed on him. They still made me do the interview process and all the rest of it. And Souter was on the committee, so I started pontificating about something or other. And then Souter leaned back and said, Bill, could you defend that last assertion you made? And I thought, what the hell am I doing here? I'm sitting before a Supreme Court justice, and he's asking me to defend, an assertion that I made. So anyway, he's a good personal friend, and I defended the assertion well enough that I got hired. But his papers are great, and he came to us, and it was either us or Harvard for his papers. And he said, my conditions are, he decided he wanted them at the Historical Society in New Hampshire, but he said they must remain under seal for 50 years, until 50 years after my death. And people pushed back a little bit and said, gee, Justice Souter, that seems like an awfully long time. To which he replied, it's either my way or the fireplace for those papers. So everybody saluted and said, okay. And I guess he's a very conservative guy, belt and suspenders. And one of his colleagues on the court, I can't remember which one, but somebody left his papers and said they should be sealed until my death. And he died sooner than he thought he was going to die. And some of the stuff that came out was pretty current. So it was a problem. And so Souter said, I'm going to err in the other direction and these things are gonna be locked up forever. But when the truck from DC came up with the papers all in bankers boxes, I remember our curator said he picked up the first box and it said Bush v. Gore 2000 written on the top of this box. And boy, this guy wanted to rip that box open to see what was in there, but they're still locked up. 2 sets of keys, sealed filing cabinets, all this kind of thing. So I won't be around to see him unless David relents and lets us open him sooner.
Wow, interesting. So I understand that the Historical Society is actually helping town historical societies, of which in New England there are many. I grew up in Massachusetts, and certainly the one in my town was an old and venerable but rarely open institution. Now it's a much more modern and sophisticated one. But to talk a little bit about your help, the help you've provided to town historical societies.
Sure. So one element of this digital initiative I mentioned that we paid for with our last capital campaign was to see if we could help local historical societies digitize their own collections. And New Hampshire's, like a lot of probably New England states and other states around the country, virtually every little town and every city has its own historical society. And some of them have really amazing stuff in their collections, but very few people know about it. So we created something called the New Hampshire History Network, which is an online platform that allows local historical societies to digitize some of their collections and put them onto the site. So we're creating sort of a statewide database of historical material. We provide technical support to them, help them figure out how. Some of them are pretty sophisticated and they know how to do it, but some are just learning how to digitize and sort of how to live in this 21st century world. So we've helped them, and we've got a number. There are larger places that have professional staffs. Manchester, Keene, some other larger towns in the state have paid staff, but a lot of these places are 100% volunteer. And so it's a very successful program, and we've gotten some. I was looking at one, for example, one little historical society had a letter written by George Washington to General Sullivan, one of the generals in the Revolutionary War, New Hampshire generals, and nobody knew they had this thing. And so it's now, it's on the New Hampshire History Network. So this thing is building over time. We're recruiting additional members, training them, and trying to build this sort of statewide database of historical material.
Yeah, that's really interesting. An historian told me one time that he viewed town historical societies, or in some places county historical societies, as this sort of black hole of primary source material.
Yes.
It was there. It had occasional gems, but it was essentially inaccessible. And digitizing is like finding a whole new seam of some valuable ore that you can access, and that no one knew about before. At least that was his argument. So
Yes,
it's pretty interesting that you're doing that, and it sounds like it's paying off, with a few interesting finds. So talk to us a little bit about the more ambitious and more time-consuming and equally important project of creating a civics curriculum and sort of history, introduction to history and the methods of history for elementary school kids in New Hampshire, and it has an interesting birth story. So
Sure.
with that.
And this is been my top project for the past 3 or 4 years. It's called the Democracy Project, Renewing History, Civics, and Social Studies in New Hampshire Schools. And the genesis of this was that the New Hampshire Historical Society sees about 10,000 school kids a year that come to our programs. Either they come to the society or we go out into classrooms. We have several museum teachers that go out into the classrooms. And our director of education came to me, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago and said, we have to change our curriculum because the last few years, the kids that we're seeing, and these are mainly upper elementary kids, level kids who are 4th, 5th, 6th graders. That's the year one of those years they're learning state history. Then they move on to US history later on. Anyway, she said, the kids do not know that the American Revolution existed. They don't know that we fought the British. They don't know anything about it. And I thought she was joking at first, but I viewed that as kind of my canary in the coal mine moment because she was not joking. So there were a number of nonprofits in the state of New Hampshire, sort of leading ones. There's the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, which is the big community foundation in the state. The New Hampshire Bar Association was very involved with this. New Hampshire Humanities Council, a couple of other nonprofits. We were meeting, representatives from the groups were meeting to talk about really the crisis in civics literacy in the country. This erosion at the school kid level is just one symptom of it. I mean, we're seeing what's happened with adult voters and the lack of understanding about how our system works. So we're talking about this, and we're all on the same page, but we'd go back to our day jobs, and then 3 months later, 2 months later, have another meeting, and everybody was complaining and bemoaning the state of affairs, and then we'd leave, and we'd come back in 2 or 3 months, and nothing. It was just no traction. Nothing was happening. So I went to our board of trustees, and I said, we can't solve the whole problem. If one of the problems was, I think the group was looking at everything from voter registration and the social media issues, screwing up discourse and all the rest. It's so huge that nobody, where do you start? So we said, well, we can pick off a very discrete area where we have expertise, which is education. We already have 10,000 school kids a year to come to our program, so we have a lot of experience there. Why don't we try to help? And we started talking to teachers who said, there's no social studies, history, civics resources at the lower level. The previous curriculum was way out of date. They were printed textbooks, which are no longer used. They were outdated anyway. And so we decided to launch what I mentioned was called the Democracy Project. And it was really a 3-legged stool. It was to create a new curriculum that would be given to all the schools in the state at no charge, to train teachers in social studies and how to use this curriculum, but also some other more general training for teachers, educators, and then advocacy was the third thing. So we had to raise a little bit over $1 million. Most of the money went to develop the curriculum. I should say also, New Hampshire is a quirky state in many ways. It's a local control state. So the state Department of Education does not furnish curricular resources to the school districts. They go out and get their own. So it's a very weak, underfunded state education department. So we said, a nonprofit's going to have to step into this void and create the curriculum, or else none will exist. So we went out, and my job was mainly to raise money and to sort of get the people in place, the experts, to develop the curriculum. So we raised the money, hired some terrific curriculum developers, 2 or 3 young women, all young women who were really terrific, and began developing this curriculum. And it's a very, it's being adopted now more and more. We launched, it's been sort of a soft launch. COVID kind of interfered with how to kick the thing off, but the beauty of it is that we've also trained approximately 300 teachers over the past 3 years in summer institutes, and we pay them stipends to attend. I mean, which is a good way to get people to come, and they get continuing ed credits and all the rest. So they've now gone out into their schools all over the state, and they're kind of exponents of this curriculum. So we've discovered, instead of top down where we sell this to the superintendents and school boards, where it's kind of organically growing bottom up, and schools are adopting it, and it's and also homeschoolers, it's available to them. So it's free of charge, no passwords, no anything, anybody can get on it. And it's been a huge success, and we've gotten some national notoriety from this project. The curriculum itself is called Moose on the Loose, and it's delivered via the internet, and it's broken into units so that you don't have to do the whole. There are 18 units, but you don't have to start at number 1 and go to number 18. There are a bunch of different ways a teacher can pick 3 or 4 units, and there are logical pathways through the curriculum that tie them together, because frankly, there's not enough time to do all 18 probably anyway in a typical school year. So it's a big problem we have, not only in New Hampshire, but across the country. And I think there's a growing awareness. What happened was, with No Child Left Behind, Common Core, and a lot of these very well-intentioned initiatives, they had the effect of squeezing social studies out of a lot of curriculums around the country. And so it just sort of happened without people knowing it. And then STEM, a lot of focus on math and science, also had that effect. But there's been a recognition that we're going to turn out completely uninformed electorate and citizens if we don't address this. So we're very happy with this project, and we're looking at maybe version 2.0 in the next year or two. We're not sure what that'll be yet, but it's been for me, it's been one of the most gratifying things I've ever done professionally, to get this thing sort of off the ground. And my job is to be the facilitator, enabler of the experts to get the thing. So I kind of got it organized, got it going, and then just got out of the way, basically. So,
well, this is a good time, I think, to show just a little hint of what it's like. And Bill has edited down, or had edited down, a larger, longer kind of promotional video that's shown to teachers to kind of tell them what the curriculum is about. We got 2 minutes of it that we're going to play. It's kind of hyperkinetic, but it does give a sense of certainly the diversity, complexity, and depth of the curriculum. So, Jim, if you could roll that, it'd be great.
Okay, let me share my screen here. And I'll pull this up.
I should say this is not the curriculum, it's a promotional video to get people to do it.
Let me know if the volume is right.
A little higher, I think.
A little higher?
Louder.
Okay, there we are.
Great. Well, that's pretty cool, I have to say. And it it's obvious, but it's worth noting that none of this would have been possible without the digital revolution and the digitizing of pictures and maps and objects that you described earlier. So it's two important trends kind of intersecting, or two waves that are in sync and augmenting each other. So pretty interesting. How many kids, or how many schools or school systems have used it so far?
So we're still getting our arms around it. We use Google Analytics to help us sort of figure out how many people are visiting. And this past year, we've had about 25,000 unique visitors. Because of privacy rules, you can't get a good handle on how many of those are kids, but we are able to see that virtually 100% of the unique visitors are there between 8:30 in the morning and 2:30 in the afternoon on weekdays, which is when school's in session. So I think it's a pretty good proxy for, that they're kids. But we actually, we will be doing more kind of outreach to schools to get a better sense on the adoption rate. But we know just anecdotally that it's being adopted, in a sort of a curve, just increasing all the time. So happy about it. So we'll have more analytics down the road in the next year or two. I mentioned an anecdote to you, David. I'll just repeat. The New Hampshire Humanities Council, which is a nonprofit that does what its name implies, hired a new executive director a year ago who had been a curator at the Holocaust Museum in DC. And he came to New Hampshire knowing essentially nothing about the state. And so he told me that he found out about this Moose on the Loose curriculum. He'd actually used it and dived into it pretty deeply to try to learn about kind of this strange place he's come to. So I thought that was amusing because he's a 50-year-old guy, So one of the things we had to do was, you have to write this, and the language that you use has to be pitched to kind of a 5th grade reading level. And that's really hard, especially some of these concepts. Like I remember our staff was working on a unit about the New Hampshire presidential primary, which is a big deal up here. And it was brutal trying to get that to explain the concepts surrounding a presidential primary pitched at that level. There's actually software you can buy that runs everything you've written through and tells you what grade level it's written to. And we were running it through, and the first pass, it was written at like a 12th grade level. So it was a big task to get it, pitched to the right level. And but I think the staff did a great job, and it's not only intelligible to a 4th or 5th grader, but it's not horribly boring to an adult either.
Interesting. So, Bill, as we all know, school curricula is a huge political issue now, with parents and politicians. They've always had something to say, of course, but it's a source of division. It's one of the many things dividing the country into various camps, some red and blue and other designations. Have you run into any problems in that regard, or are there people who think that the Moose on the Loose curriculum has a certain slant that they object to, or has that not been an issue?
Knock on wood, so far we're okay. It's obviously an issue we've been paying attention to closely, and we've been pretty scrupulous about trying to, at every point, not hit those nerves, especially on one side of the political spectrum. And we've made it so far. What's complicated life a little bit is that we have the commissioner of the state Department of Education is a guy who basically wants to run for governor. He's a hard right ideologue who narrowly lost the Republican nomination a few years ago to the current governor, Sununu, who was very popular. So Sununu, doing what a lot of politicians do, appointed his rival to try to get him sort of put to the side. So this guy's been commissioner of education, but he's been essentially running for office using that platform. And there've been some things coming out of the Department of Education. There was a bill that passed in the state legislature, divisive concepts bill, which was a horrible bill. And it's the typical, I don't want to get on a political thing here, but it's the thing of tying the hands of teachers, saying you can't ever say anything negative about the United States of America or you're in trouble. He set up a hotline so parents could, call in if they had a concern about a teacher, and just crazy stuff. So I authored an op-ed that took him to tasks. And so we thought really long and hard about whether we wanted to poke the bear, but we went ahead and did it. But that's separate from the curriculum. And so up till now, we've been able to avoid controversy. The one other thing I'd say is, because our Department of Education, the way we're set up in New Hampshire, it's local control. Every school district does what they want. It would be pretty hard for the people at the state government in Concord to get in our way anyway. This thing is growing organically. And if the town likes it, they don't really care what this commissioner thinks. But it's definitely been on our radar right along, because you got to be careful. We've definitely taken into account in the language that's used in some of the curriculum to try to avoid hot button or things that could be perceived to be hot button. So far, so good. I'm sure we're gonna, because I've just said it's fine, probably tomorrow I'll have an email complaining, but up till now we've been okay.
Interesting. So one of the interesting things about history is that even though it's all over with, it needs to be updated, and I'm wondering if you have plans, or if there's some mechanism in place to update this regularly so that it doesn't become obsolete. It becomes an institution that's self-refreshing in the state.
I think, yeah, and actually digital is what enables us to do that. Using example again of the curriculum, because it's not a printed textbook, which once it's printed, that's it, and it becomes obsolete in a few years. We're actually adding new stuff to the curriculum now, even though it's barely been launched. So yeah, digital gives us tremendous flexibility to continue to adapt and stay current. And what I like about not only the educational project that we've had, but just the overall digital initiative, is there's a perception that history is, musty, dusty for old, fusty people. And also there's a little bit of an elitist tinge to a place like the New Hampshire Historical Society, tends, a certain type of people used to belong. It used to be membership only, that kind of thing. And I think that's it. We're opening the place up and becoming more accessible, and kind of taking that, I hope taking the perception that history is a static, boring thing, and countering that perception. And I think that, as we all know, as good liberal arts graduates, I mean, you've got to study the past to help inform your actions today. And but our national collective memory is just so shallow, or I'm not sure what the right adjective is, but we're on to the next thing really fast. And I think it's, to the extent we can make ourselves to use a 60s word, relevant, the better, because history has an awful lot to teach us.
Really interesting, Bill. Okay, so let's, I haven't looked in the chat, but there may be some questions. Jim is going to be sort of running that. So let's open it to questions.
I just looked in the chat and there are no questions in the chat. So we're going to go live with questions here from our audience. And I would ask people to either physically raise their hand, or you can raise the hand that's available to you down under the reactions tab on your Zoom controls. So I'll take a pop. Dave Ware, why don't you go ahead and unmute and go ahead and speak, please?
Okay, thanks. Bill, you mentioned that you've taken care in your modules to sort of steer clear of some hot buttons. I'm curious to know to what extent have you addressed in your various modules what some people are referring to today as sort of the racial reckoning, or you know, information that's sort of consistent with 1619 project type of exposure, for lack of a better word, of the broader, you know, truer, if you will, history of slavery, and in particular how the New England states were involved in the slave trade and in slave holding. I wonder to what extent, I'm just curious if these modules are directed toward the later elementary years, what kinds of things are included in it in that arena?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the answer is we have not shied away from that. And as you say, New England, and I have a lot of friends from Virginia and places south of Virginia, and New Englanders in the past have sometimes been a little bit sanctimonious about the whole issue of slavery and all of the attendant issues surrounding it. But we certainly in New England had far from clean hands, and we cover that. I mean, the shipping, Portsmouth was a shipping center. There were a number of enslaved people in New Hampshire, pre-revolutionary mainly, up through the Revolution, and we cover all that. I think one thing is, because this is a state history curriculum, because the upper elementary school years are the years that's when the state history is studied. We get a lot of U.S. history there because New Hampshire was one of the 13 original colonies. So just sort of, you get a lot of U.S. history, but New Hampshire has less, because it's state history, and it was a narrow, relatively narrow issue here compared to some parts of the country. It's less prominent, but we have absolutely not shied away from it, and we cover it. And actually, what's more prominent is indigenous people. Those are complete units. The Abenaki in New England, and how they were displaced and all that. And so one of the nice things about history is that it's based on facts. So we have a very clear conscience if we're presenting facts, that we're prepared to take criticism because we can refute it. And so we never went into this with the attitude that I'm glad I don't live maybe in Texas or somewhere, but it might be a little tougher because the legislature down there is maybe a little more heavy-handed. So part of it is the culture in New Hampshire, that it's much more decentralized to begin with, but we've not shied away from any of the issues, and we're prepared to defend our presentation if anybody criticizes us on any of those.
No. Let me just say I think that's great, and let me just add one more quick thing before I mute myself, and that is to just tell you that coincidentally last night I had the pleasure of listening to Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who participated in an event here in Hartford, Connecticut. We have an institution, if you will, called the Connecticut Forum, where speakers are invited to talk on important topics. And she was our guest last night at the Connecticut Forum in front of although she was present by video rather than in person. The Bushnell Auditorium in Hartford was sold out to listen to the justice speak. And you probably know this, but she is very much of accord with your sense and your organization's sense of how important it is to sort of rekindle civic education. She's a huge proponent of that. She's written books. She's written children's books in particular. She seems to be the proudest of those children's books she has written. So she's right there alongside of you. You probably know that, but the other guys may not know it. I mean, this awareness of the issue it is far and wide and deep, and reaches even into the chambers of our nation's highest court. So just a little plug for that.
Okay, great, thanks.
Very
Yeah,
good.
the pendulum, I think, is swinging, fortunately.
Now, Bob Hicks, you had your hand up before. Do you still want to unmute and ask a question?
I can unmute. I was going to ask about how they were dealing with indigenous people, but he answered the question, and then I think Jay Swanson's got his hand up, but so I'm going to defer to Jay.
Let's move on to Jay. Jay, you'll need to
In past
unmute.
history has always been a good thing for me to do.
Thanks.
Thanks, Bob. I guess this is payback for something I did when I was a roommate freshman year. So, Bill, thanks. That's all great stuff. I mean, I think, and the curriculum, Moose and the Loose, is intended as an elementary school curriculum.
That's right.
Yeah. So, apropos, to follow up on what Dave was saying, Dave Ware, I would think that at that level, you may be introducing concepts like slavery to the children for the first time. It's not like, your 1619 is a pretty advanced, analysis of something that, I don't know, I guess I have the question. I mean, are the kids, in your experience, generally aware that we have a history of slavery in this country?
I think they are aware, but they have to be told about it. They're aware after they take our curriculum anyway. But more generally, I'm not sure I have a good answer, Jay, about whether they've learned it just as they've lived their lives and seen the information that's circulated. I know that there's a chance that a lot of kids aren't really very aware of it because they're aware of very little in terms of our national history. I mean, that's really kind of the crisis. I mean, when you think about it, when you were a kid, you learned a lot about the American Revolution when you were pretty young. And I wasn't making it up when I said, the kids coming to us a few years ago had not heard of it. They didn't know it had happened. They didn't know we fought the British. They didn't. I mean, there was just a vacuum there. So in that sense, there probably is a vacuum in terms of the history of slavery as well. But certainly if they take our curriculum, they will learn about it, because they'll learn that it was present here in New Hampshire, and therefore, and how that related to the larger world and the triangular trade and all the rest of it. But I don't know the answer to whether they are.
Yeah.
We focus this curriculum on state history because there is very good U.S. history curriculum that's out there that's available to schools all around the country. And so for us, the crisis was at the state level, in the lower years. So typically in most parts of the country, kids take town history, and then they take state history, then they take U.S. history, then world history, and civics is in there somewhere. New Hampshire did pass a law a couple of years ago because the legislature was starting to realize this was a problem. and they mandated more civics in 10th grade. Our view was, and that's good, but our view was that if they've had no preparation in the lower years, trying to graft civics on to this, when there isn't the foundational knowledge, not very effective. So we're trying to create the foundational piece.
Okay, thanks.
Steve Klegman, you'll have to unmute.
Yeah, first, Bill, thanks a lot for doing this. It's been interesting, and I'm sure the rest of us really appreciate your telling us about this. You sort of started to answer the question I was going to ask, which I was going to say, I hope that I could ask you a couple things that maybe you could follow through on and keep you busy for the next 15, 20 years. But I mean, I don't know a great deal about this, but it certainly seems to be a national problem. The politics or the personalities in New Hampshire may be distinct or unique, but what's going on in the rest of the country? I mean, there are people who are doing this around. Are you in touch with each other? And I was a little, shouldn't say surprised, but didn't expect you to understate as you did the need for more of this or improvement of it, the civics part, not so much the history part at the high school level. Because again, just a vague impression that I have. Certainly I don't know a lot about it, but boy, it seems like kids are getting out of high school without knowing a whole lot about how the government works. Now, maybe that's bad, maybe it's there and it's bad teaching, or students aren't paying attention, but it doesn't seem to be happening. But is this, I mean, are you guys way out in front? Is this a national thing? Is there stuff going on around the country?
Yeah, I think it's pretty highly variable. One other related problem is that a lot of the younger teachers coming out of college to going into, or young educators going into teaching, have had some cases zero social studies or history themselves. And in the lower level years, the lower grades, a teacher teaches more than one subject. And so if they're, fairly well versed in math and English language arts, they call it ELA, that's one thing. But we've discovered some of the 20-something teachers, newly minted teachers, aren't a hell of a lot better off than the kids in terms of their level of knowledge. So that's why a lot of this teacher training we've done in these summer institutes, some of it's kind of remedial. So it's a multi-pronged problem. As far as around the country, it's pretty variable. I mean, there are states where the state legislatures, governors, and departments of education have turned this thing into a political football, which is unfortunate, but it's happening in certain states. Other states are doing a much better job. There are certain states that have really strong curriculum. I think Minnesota is one that happens to have a really good one. So we're in touch, but I wouldn't say we're in touch a lot of the time. We just we kind of hear things now and then, anecdotally, but it's pretty variable. But I would say overall, there's a very strong recognition that it's a crisis. And I think the politics of the last half dozen years have made people way more sensitive to the fact that we've got a big problem on our hands. So I think there are efforts happening all around the country to address this. And but it's it's a little bit piecemeal. It's kind of state by state. The curriculum, one of the things we did, the Common Core, which is they teach, one thing we heard from educators a ton was, well, they test reading and English language proficiency, and they test math. Those are standardized tests, and the schools are evaluated based on the results of these, how the kids do in these tests. There's no social studies test, there's no civics test. If you want to have us pay attention to that, you really ought to figure out a way to get a test put in for that. But by the way, we don't want any more tests. So it's kind of a circular deal. But that's a problem. So that one of the things we've done is sort of a stealth, try to have a little bit of a stealth move to get them to use this, is teaching English language arts. We're encouraging schools to use our curriculum as the way that they can teach reading proficiency. You might as well have them read something. Let's have them read this, have them read our stuff. There's an interesting phenomenon. I don't get too far in the weeds about the pedagogy that's going on nationally, but there's content versus skills discussion. And there's a big move to teach skills. In other words, you teach kids how to look at a paragraph and have the analytical skills to deconstruct the arguments and all the rest. But content's irrelevant, is this theory, and therefore, it doesn't matter what they read. We'll teach them the skills, and then they can read anything. And that's caused a moving away from history, for example, reading history, which is content. And so we're making an argument that kids have to, if you don't have a chronological framework to put things in, if you can't figure out that World War II came after the Civil War, that impairs your ability to think critically. You need the framework of content as well as skill development. So this is stuff going on at schools of education all around the country, these debates, but I think there needs to be more focus on content. And so what we've tried to do is sneak our content in under the guise of helping educators develop skills proficiency as well.
Can I just ask one quick follow-up to that? What I would think is an argument that people would be responsive to is putting aside the skill content dichotomy is, we need citizens who know something and they don't. Isn't that a problem? I don't know how much that moves people, but it's sort of hard to disagree with.
I'll share an anecdote. Someone mentioned, Sandra Sotomayor talking, Dave Ware. David Souter, who's been was a longtime trustee at the Historical Society. And I had known him earlier. And so back a dozen years ago, he said to me, my great fear for this country is not from any threat from without. It's the rise of a dictatorial, authoritarian personality who says, I alone can fix it. And because people in this country have lost, their knowledge of how we work. The three branches of government, I think fewer than 50% of the American citizenry can name the three branches of government. I mean, everybody knows it's the IRS and the Postal Service and the National Guard. But anyway, I use that line in some of my talks, and it really alarms me when nobody laughs. But, anyway, so Souter predicted it. He said, this is the biggest threat to the United States future is the erosion, the rot really from within rather than any external threat, and the lack of literacy in the area of civics.
Okay, I saw a couple more hands. Richard Wolf or Paul Reingold. Richard? You'll need to unmute.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to respond because one reason I got on, Bill, was because I'm working with a nonprofit that is focused more on the middle school and high school age kids. And there are great deficits there. I had the great pleasure in my earlier years to work with Congressman Abner Mikva, who became a judge and then a White House counsel. And when he was leaving government, some of us who'd worked for him wanted to set up some sort of internship. Since he'd been in 3 branches of government, we thought we'd do some sort of internship along those lines. And he and his wife, Zoe, who was a teacher, said, well, that's a great idea, but no, we don't really want that. What we really wanted, they started asking us questions about when we first got involved in politics and in civic life. And a lot of us had done it in high school and on into college, obviously at Amherst. And so he really wanted things directed more at sort of urban areas where they don't get that exposure so much. And we started a nonprofit called Mikvah Challenge. Mikvah Challenge really, and the motto there is democracy is a verb. It's getting these kids involved in the democratic process, the civic process early on. And so, one of the things they have is a project, and teachers are also trained. So there is a curriculum. One project is something called Project Soapbox, where social studies classes, the kids are to pick just one subject in their community that's important to them personally, and then they research it, write about it, develop a soapbox speech, like a 90-second soapbox speech. And the way the kids respond to this has been rather amazing. And the subjects are across the board. I mean, it's been from gun violence and all that to girls talking about menstruation in high school. I mean, it's all over the place. And they also are involved in nonpartisan political activities. They've had field trips to New Hampshire for the primaries, to Iowa for the caucuses, to South Carolina last primary. And it's been I think a great eye opener for me, that when they get involved, once they're involved, they're totally hooked. The follow-up with them because it's now been 20 years, the follow-up of how many are engaged civically and politically is quite positive. So you can go on their website, mikvahchallenge.org, if you want to know more about that. But I'm really pleased to hear someone's addressing this at the elementary level too, obviously, because by the time they get to middle school and high school, you can lose them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think an all of the above strategy is what we need.
Yeah. Paul?
Dunner, it's nice to see a New Hampshire face. I think there are only
Yeah.
4 of us in the class.
That's right.
And so I always like it when I feel reconnected to the Granite State. I just wanted to remind people that your comment about what Suter said it echoes what George Katab said in 1971 or 72, which was that the real threat to democracy in this country will be when the working class feels so disenfranchised that they take a sharp turn to the right. And George, as usual, was right. The question that I had for you, you pretty much answered. I kind of wanted to know how you got this off the ground when all the educators I know, it's really hard to move them from the curriculum that they're doing, and to find space for something new is really hard. It's your answer to fold this into the ELA part of the curriculum is brilliant. That's the way I think you have to do it. Do you have a sense of what folks are giving up when they're teaching these units, to make time to do it?
That's a good question, Paul. I don't have an answer there. We're trying to get sort of shelf space. We so many. My top metric when I talk to our staff about this project as we were getting it off the ground, I said I want more minutes per week spent on social studies, history, civics at this grade level. That's to me, that's the measure of success. And we don't really have good numbers yet there. I mean, we know that it's being adopted and we know they're using it. What's being displaced, I'm not sure. I'm hoping, as I said, if we can get them to use it as a vehicle for ELA, English Language Arts, then it's a twofer, and maybe nobody has to be squeezed out. But at this point, we're not sure. It's still sort of in the adoption stage, different places. So we need to get out. Our plan was to get out and be in the schools and interview and talk and capture data. And of course, the whole COVID thing kind of sidetracked that. But in the next year or so, we plan to get a much better handle on how much are we moving the needle on hours spent, minutes spent on this curriculum? But we're not quite there yet.
Very good. Butch, did you start to see you put your hand up? Did you want to ask a question?
Yes, first I want to thank you for this wonderful exchange and remind me how important context is, historical context. We have the same problem. I'm involved in a university in Western Amazon, Brazilian Amazon. We're also working with high school students now. And in our case, we try to give them context about climate change. And history is fundamental. More in the natural history, but also human history, great acceleration, and so on. So I would encourage you to continue along this line and providing more context, because that's what people need in order to make the decisions of how we're going to proceed in the coming decades. So thank you for your initiative, and I hope it expands.
Very good. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Let me slide in a question or two myself, Bill. Is there any difference in the uptake or interest from the private schools versus the public schools there in New Hampshire?
Not really. So there are different groups that can use this curriculum. The public schools, the largest. Homeschoolers, don't know exactly the number, but between 5 and 10% of the kids in New Hampshire, we think, are being homeschooled. And we've actually done programs just for homeschool audience to have them training for the parents to come in. They pay us, it's for this workshop, but they're really looking for content. And so they're a big audience. There aren't a lot of private K-6 schools in New Hampshire. There are some, and they're using the curriculum, again, because it's totally open access. We thought about, when we designed it initially, well, we've got all the teacher stuff, the lesson plans and all that. Do we want the kids to see that? And then we said, why not? I mean, who cares? So let's make it completely open access, no passwords, no anything. So we're getting homeschool groups, most public schools, private schools are using it, although it's not a big group. And then also after school, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, those types of groups are using it as well.
Very good. Bob Hicks.
You actually gave me the lead in, Bill. I've been the citizenship counselor for the Boy Scouts in my town for many years, and much of the civics that you listed, that you talk about in the program, is covered in the citizenship in the community and the citizenship in the country, et cetera. And I was just wondering to what extent, obviously, whether you were aware of all of that content, as well as to the extent of, I would think that would certainly be a venue that would be of interest to local scouting organizations, both girls and boys.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a group we're putting, again, a lot of this ends up, you build a nice product, but for those of you who've been in business, then you got to market it. So we're moving into that phase more, although, as I said, it's been great because the uptake has been very, very organic and sort of just happening, which is ideal if you can do it. That if it happens that way, that's great. But we intend to do more marketing in the coming couple of years, including to groups like Scouts.
Very good.
But word of mouth is the best. I mean, word of mouth is really good. And so that's what's helping us a lot, is word of mouth. And we're a tiny state. I mean, the population of New Hampshire is 1.3 million people. So, I think I know about half of the people in the state. So
What kind of a budget are you running this on, Bill, per year?
Well, so it was $1.2 million that we needed to raise to develop the curriculum. And, that's not insignificant we're a relatively small nonprofit, but one saying I've always adhered to is that vision without resources is hallucination.
Yeah.
So the first step was for me to go out and raise the money. And I will say fundraising is never easy in the nonprofit sector, but this was a pretty easy case to make. I mean, there's a recognition that it's a big problem. And so we raised the money from local foundations and some generous individual donors, a handful of companies. And it took a year and a half maybe to raise the money. But what happened was we got the first half of it and we launched. We hired people and got going. I said, I know we can raise the rest of it, but let's get going, because the curriculum development is pretty time consuming. So, so that's what it took. Now, the budget going forward is we're sort of absorbing that right now into our operating budget at the Historical Society. And so the ongoing cost of this is more staff than anything else. And so we'll have to see how that goes in terms of how, a lot of our fundraising for general fundraising talks a lot about our educational initiative, because it sells. I mean, people like it. And so our fundraising has been helped by this initiative, certainly, but we're absorbing it into the annual budget now. And we've got a really good education department of about 3 full-time people. And so a lot of their job is kind of keeping this thing, the care and feeding of this initiative. We also have an education program that is, aside from this whole Moose on the Loose curriculum. As I mentioned earlier, we see about 10,000 kids a year, and that program is just a separate ongoing program, the program that's been going on since the 1970s.
Okay, very good. Bob, you have your hand up again?
I had one question that you started to address, Bill, which was, have you set up an endowment or some long-term funding apparatus to keep this both current and up and running? And then the second question I had, and it's really not to Bill, but it is to Bill as well as to everybody, because it's getting late and some of us need to go elsewhere. I just wanted to make sure that all of you on the call are planning to come to Reunion. And if you're not, you should, because you get to see more of all of the people you're seeing here. We'll continue to send you things that tell you about it, but please plan on it. And one thing I would suggest is if you don't want to stay in a dorm, which I can't imagine why you wouldn't want to stay in a dorm, you might want to start looking at reservations for hotels now, because they do fill up. And I know, you don't want to have the dorm as being your last resort. You would rather have something anyway. So I hope everyone is planning to come to Reunion. And then with that, I'm going to thank you all, and I've got to disappear. But
Bob,
good to see
before you
all.
leave, remind us of the dates of the reunion again.
It is it's like the last few days of May and the first Saturday. It's first part of June.
May 31st through June 3rd. Yeah. So.
Right.
31st.
All the fools who aren't planning to come, raise your hands.
And from a history standpoint, Bill, we are having we'll have a special tour of the Emily Dickinson House just for the class on Thursday afternoon.
Sounds great.
So a little bit of history for you.
Yeah, and to answer your question, we're fortunate, we have a pretty good endowment at the society now. And so that some of the endowment draw will help fund this program going forward.
Excellent. And thank you, Bill, for doing it. And thank you all for being here. This is wonderful to me. I'm thrilled to see you all.
Very good. Thank you, Bob. Okay, last call for questions, and then we need to shut this down. So Jay, did you have another comment?
No, I was just going to say we're coming up on an hour and 20 minutes, and so I think we do need to wind it up. But I suppose if there's a last question, fire away.
Looks like we're good.
And if not, once again, Bill, this was really, really interesting and obviously important too. So thank you very much. Jim, thanks for setting it up. We'll do another one of these in probably
Couple of months, right?
early January. We got a few ahead, actually. Stephen Keith is going to be one of the guests. Steve Scheinman suggested maybe we get the new president of Amherst on. I might try to squeeze him in if he's interested. That would be quite a score. Anyway, thank you all very much, and I'll see you next time. Have a good Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Good
Stay
holiday.
safe. Bye now.